Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out to the Old State Capitol tonight. My name is Ashley Franklin, and I'm the education curator here. It is our mission to help educate the public on Louisiana's rich history. We do that tonight by continuing with the second of 3 lectures focusing on the Reconstruction era in Louisiana. We do this also as part of our planning for an upcoming exhibit on Reconstruction. Please note there are 2 brief surveys for y'all in the audience to complete after tonight's lecture that can be found on that back table over there. There's also a list of the rest of our exhibits for this year that you can look forward to as well. Tonight, the Old State Capitol and the Secretary of State, Nancy Landry, welcome Dr. R. Blakeslee Gilpin. Dr. Gilpin received his PhD in history from Yale University. Today, he is an associate professor at Tulane University and their director of the Graduate Studies program. Dr. Gilpin's research interest and teaching revolve around the history of slavery and its legacies. He is a published author and is one of the scholars on our Reconstruction Exhibit Advisory Council. We welcome here tonight for his talk.
It's oriented somehow. Thank you all so much for coming. I just want to say a special thank you for all the coordination work by Ashley Franklin and all the folks here at the Old State Capitol. This is my first time here, and it's just an amazing building, and I'm so happy to talk with you all tonight. It should come as no surprise that I think that the work that you all are doing here is so important. We can always know more about history generally, but particularly the history of the state of Louisiana, and even more specifically, this crucial period that so many Americans have wanted to forget over the last 150 years. Perhaps the main thing I would like to emphasize tonight is the act of remembering this period, Reconstruction, which has mostly been defined by historians as just a 12-year period following the end of the Civil War from 1865 to 1877, is actually a much broader period in the story of Louisiana. And tonight, what I would like to share with you all is what I think is really the astounding and glorious experiment that was Louisiana's interracial democracy that stretched from about 1862 to 1898. And so I would call that kind of the long Reconstruction of Louisiana. And this is a period that really took place in spite of some really awful and violent determination by white Louisianans to continue to marginalize and discriminate against Black Louisianans. But this is really an astonishing 36-year period that witnessed a pretty inspiring obsession with practicing the most fundamental act of democracy, which is the vote. So let's see if this works. All right. The story I'm going to tell you about tonight is really about 2 clashing narratives. One is about the dogged white supremacist efforts to prevent Black civil rights. And the other is about an even more determined and historically remarkable story about the Black pursuit of civil rights, and particularly the right to vote. I wanted to open with a short story or a little anecdote about a formerly enslaved Louisianan named John J. Moore. He returned to St. Mary Parish after the Civil War, and this is the same place he had been enslaved. And he took up work hoeing cane, but also, and much more significantly, he was organizing Republican political clubs across various plantations. It did not take long for a group of white men to find and threaten Moore. Moore had been hidden by his friends in anticipation of this, and as he was hidden, he heard this white gang try to coax information about his whereabouts from these fellow Republicans. And this is all from testimony before Congress about the violence that took place in Louisiana during the Reconstruction period. He recalled the gang's pitch to his friends. "There is but one way that you people can live here with us, and that is to let politics die. Leave them alone. You cannot live with us and live and work and vote against our interests. All that you get and all that you have comes from us and by us. And now if you do not let politics alone, you will get killed here. It is white people's business. The business of Negroes is to go into the fields and work, and we will pay you. Moore told Congress that despite his political activities giving him only what he called a very poor chance at survival, he had no choice but to continue organizing. And this is really kind of the point I'm trying to make in a nutshell tonight, which is that Black Louisianans like Moore responded to white supremacist violence with defiance rather than deference. And what continues to astonish me about Louisianans like Moore is that we are talking about him organizing political clubs on plantations less than a decade removed from slavery in the state of Louisiana. It's just a really remarkable transition. And that brings up a very good question about the history of Louisiana, which is how slavery actually ended. See if this works. Where do I go? Oh, I didn't have that up for that one. All right. U.S. Marines raised the American flag over public buildings in New Orleans on April 29th of 1862, and Louisiana became the first state to experience widespread military occupation during the Civil War. The presence of Union troops completely changed the institution of slavery and enslaved people themselves. And even before slavery was legally ended in December of 1865, is it going to go? I'm going to keep trying to make this work. There we go. Enslaved Louisianans were going to New Orleans. They were going to where the Union actually was. They physically moved their bodies to pursue basic civil rights. And in many ways, Louisiana became a testing ground for what peace after this terrible war was going to look like. It became a testing ground for how the federal government might help or not help once slavery was ended. And it also became a testing ground for how Black Americans would seize these opportunities for their civil rights and would shape national conversations, particularly about suffrage. Demands for political and civil equality from the free Black community of New Orleans reached all the way to Washington during this time period, and it powerfully influenced Lincoln's only call for partial Black voting rights in his final speech before being assassinated. But within just 5 years, and largely because of what was taking place in Louisiana at the dawn of Black suffrage, the 14th and 15th Amendments were passed, guaranteeing the Black right to vote, and further that the federal government would, at least in theory, protect that right. Of course, because the topic of my remarks tonight is the dawn of Black suffrage, you may grasp that my particular interest is in Black Louisianans' absolute determination to try and secure various civil rights, the vote sort of chief among them. Unfortunately, if you've spent any time around historians, you know that we are almost always deliverers of what we call, have you heard the bad news? This inspirational story that I was talking about earlier is punctuated by the many obstacles that white supremacists often violently placed in the way of Black voting in Louisiana. And that story is a much broader one than the one I can cover tonight that stretches all the way from Reconstruction to the present day. It becomes much grimmer, very conveniently after where I've stopped tonight's talk, mainly when segregation was legalized, Jim Crow began through the passage and eventually the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, but I cannot cover that in 45 minutes. So I'd like to begin by framing Louisiana's astounding and glorious experiment in interracial democracy with a word that historians have long used in application of Reconstruction, which is the word tragedy. Tragedy was used by mainly white historians to describe this period for almost 150 years. And for most of that time, until really the 1970s, white supremacist historians characterize Reconstruction as a white tragedy. This is the view in marquee films like Birth of a Nation, to the most obscure scholarly monographs over this time period. Reconstruction was treated as a period where recently emancipated slaves ran amok because Black Louisianans had, and this is according to white supremacist logic, violated the racial order that had existed since enslaved West Africans were first brought to American shores. But beginning in 1935 with a Black historian named W.E.B. Du Bois and his book Black Reconstruction, but particularly in the late 60s and early 1970s with a historian named Eric Foner, who has been engaged in essentially a lifelong campaign for Americans to better know this time period, a very different kind of tragedy emerged. And indeed, what we currently know about Reconstruction is that characterizing the period as a tragedy for whites is overwhelmingly false. Put most simply, in Louisiana from 1862 to 1898, recently enslaved people fought their way from bondage to the greatest interracial democracy the state and probably the nation has ever known. What is it that happened in 1898? I'll talk a little bit about at the end of my remarks tonight. But by 1898, 44% of all registered voters in the state of Louisiana were Black. White Louisianans could not abide this, and they pioneered Byzantine education and property requirements for any citizens whose fathers or grandfathers were not registered voters before January 1st of 1867. And it probably doesn't take long to do the math on that, that no Black voters in the state of Louisiana would be eligible after these requirements were instituted. Black voting numbers as of the late 1890s plummeted. They went from 130,334 voters to fewer than 5,320 in just 2 years. With the grandfather clause as its primary driver, the Black vote would be suppressed and it would not exceed 1% of the population of Louisiana for several decades. Indeed, whether it was the grandfather clause, literacy tests, white-only primaries, for the next 80 years, white Louisianans schemed very successfully to exclude Black voters from the body politic. And indeed, these efforts to drive Black voters from the rolls were numerically staggering. Researchers have been unsuccessful in locating a single Black Louisianan elected to office until the 1940s. And as I mentioned a minute ago, much as I'd like to extend this tale to the present day, tonight I can only tell you about Black Louisianans rising to that 44% of voters by 1898, despite some of the incredible violence that I will tell you about and the dogged resistance of white supremacists. The tragedy, to return to that word, is how Americans ever tolerated such violence and disenfranchisement and then decided to lie about it or ignore it for nearly a century. So to step back again in time, these are the arrival of Union warships to New Orleans in the spring of 1862. They did not bring freedom with them. This was not yet a war for that purpose. And indeed, as my student John Bardis, who is sitting in the audience tonight, brilliant professor of Southern history here at LSU, explains in his forthcoming book, available in April, Union officials worked with local slave owners to maintain many of the features of the slave system. But even this ominous cooperation between white Federals and white Louisianans could not stop enslaved people from pursuing freedoms and rights that had not yet been guaranteed to them anywhere in the Union. Bardis's work documents the dogged efforts made by slaves for their freedom and the troubling transition, which is also outside the scope of what I can say tonight, and it's not my research anyway, which transformed antebellum policing into the postbellum infrastructure for incarcerating Black Louisianans. In other words, Bardis's book shows the origins, at least to me, of the prison industrial complex here in Louisiana. But among the other things that my student showed me through his work is how Union-occupied New Orleans tried to deal with and incorporated the arrival of 30,000 Black Louisianans seeking their freedom over the course of the 1860s. Fugitive slaves went to New Orleans seeking de facto emancipation, safety from white violence, escape from white surveillance, and the possibility of reuniting families that had been broken up under slavery. And even before the Black population was swelling to this extent, New Orleans was experiencing the consequences of some degree of freedom arriving. Just 2 months after the Union landed in the city, plantation owners were reporting what they called a perfect stampede of Negroes. Union officers near New Orleans noted the arrival of thousands of what they called contrabands, which was a term coined by the occupying Union General Benjamin Butler for slaves of disloyal Southerners. Slaves come flocking in here, one Union commander added. The slaves have heard all sorts of stories, all tending to implant the notion that if they can only get to Union forts, they are free. By January of 1864, white elites realized that existing laws, the ones that were on the books about slavery, were inoperative and void, and desperately seized any opportunities to salvage elements of white supremacist rule. These were former Confederates eager to reestablish antebellum domination of the Black population. So in 1864, white Louisianans wrote a new constitution. That was a constitution that, in some ways, very surprisingly, abolished slavery a year before the passage of the 13th Amendment. What white Louisianans were hoping to do was to preempt the momentum that was building towards Black suffrage. Louisiana's antebellum and Confederate elites retained power after this constitution, which is not very surprising, and they were hoping to reestablish a labor system that was guided by their fears of Black suffrage. Black political organizations fought back from the earliest days of Union occupation to the extent even of running essentially pretend candidates alongside white official elections as symbolic protests, despite those Black candidates having no possibility of actually being elected or holding office. And I tell you about this weird little detail because it's something I find particularly inspiring about the history of Black Louisianans and the pursuit of the vote, which is that recently enslaved people were fighting before they were even allowed in the ring. Unfortunately, white Louisianans, guided by the white supremacist prerogatives of slavery, were also fighting against even the historical changes that have been wrought by the war itself. The immediate post-war period is defined in Louisiana and across the former Confederacy by the implementation of these things called Black codes. These are the earliest examples of white laws that were trying to maintain the level of control enjoyed during slavery. They were designed explicitly to control Black citizens, and they began to be passed as soon as the Civil War ended. Louisiana's Black Code, which was passed on December 21st of 1865, was made to be modified by individual parishes seeking to establish de facto slavery by restricting an incredible list of behaviors, from travel to employment to drinking to the clothes that people wore among Black Louisianans. The same period's Louisiana Democratic Party platform, which is authored by many of the same white elites, explicitly set out that, quote, "We hold this to be a government of white people, made and to be perpetuated for the exclusive benefit of the white race. People of African descent cannot be considered as citizens of the United States, and that there can in no event nor under any circumstances be any equality between the white and other races." This swirl of white supremacist behavior begot the New Orleans massacre. Let's see if we can get there. Of 1866. Angered by the state legislature's refusal to extend voting rights to Black men, a peaceful demonstration of mostly Black freedmen outside the Mechanic Institute on July 30th of 1866 was attacked by a mob of ex-Confederate soldiers. The whites stomped, kicked, and clubbed Black marchers mercilessly, while policemen smashed the Institute's windows and fired into it indiscriminately until the floor grew slick with blood. They emptied their revolvers while attendees desperately sought to escape. Some leaped from windows and were shot dead when they landed. Those lying wounded on the ground were stabbed repeatedly, their skulls bashed in with brickbats. The sadism was so wanton that men who kneeled and prayed for mercy were killed instantly, while dead bodies were stabbed and mutilated. Federal troops were necessary to help suppress the riot, jailing many of the white insurgents, and New Orleans remained under martial law all the way until August 3rd. Though the exact figure is still unknown, nearly 200 people were killed, almost all of them Black Louisianans. Still, even this tragedy somehow helped produce racial change. In yet another example of events in Louisiana changing American understandings of the necessity for civil rights, the New Orleans massacre propelled radical Republicans to a national supermajority, which allowed them to pass the most important civil rights legislation in the history of the United States, specifically the 14th and 15th Amendments. Now, to give you a reminder of what those are, the 13th Amendment, which was passed in 1865, is the amendment that ends slavery forever. The 14th Amendment, let's see if we can get that up, is really what I would say is the most important part of our Constitution. It's certainly the legal protection for almost every rights-based movement in the time ever since. And finally, the 15th Amendment is the amendment that technically guarantees the vote to all Americans. In broad strokes, these are the target that is set up during radical Reconstruction that white supremacists are sort of directly aiming at. And the next century is really defined by white efforts in Louisiana, white terrorist efforts most immediately, designed to intimidate Black voters, giving way to white supremacist legislation intended to disenfranchise Black voters. The most outrageous terrorist violence in American history defined this first decade of Black freedom in Louisiana, which was a ferocious blowback to the legislative advancements in civil rights. In the first elections that took place in the midst of all this legislation, the fall of 1868, over 2,000 Louisianans were killed, wounded, and otherwise injured within a few weeks prior to the presidential election. Half the state was overrun by violence, midnight raids, secret murders, and open riot that kept the people in constant terror until the election was carried by white Democrats. It's going a little too far there. I'm not sure what happened here. I'm not sure why that's happening, but I'll hopefully can get this back up. Political terrorism and violence in service of white supremacy became defining features of Reconstruction Louisiana, and they were perpetrated mainly by the Ku Klux Klan and its many imitators. In Louisiana, a group known as the Knights of the White Camellia were the dominant variation. These were bands of what were called post-war regulators, vigilantes, using violence to intimidate Black citizens by restoring some semblance of the antebellum racial order. They were often called redeemers. And the reason they were given that name is because they were trying to accomplish redemption from the loss of the American Civil War. In 1868, one St. Martinville newspaper reported white Louisianan regulators murdering a Republican judge and sheriff. The judge and sheriff reasoned the paper were pushing what they called advanced political ideas and progressive social reforms, and we are compelled to own they have met the fate they deserved. The open embrace of murder and violence to halt the advance of Black suffrage in the former Confederacy became the first lever that Southerners used to reclaim their region. Outrages during election times grew so terrible, murders, riots, blatant political fraud, that the federal government was eventually forced, despite great reluctance, to get involved on the ground in Louisiana. Elections in Louisiana and across the former Confederacy were dominated by open white paramilitary organization, wholesale intimidation backed up by mob violence and organized rioting. Indeed, white supremacist organizations like the Klan openly served as the paramilitary wing of the Democratic Party. Federal response to white terrorist violence temporarily helped squelch the Ku Klux Klan, but its imitators, like the Knights of the White Camellia in Louisiana, fought on, especially at election time. And one of the most notable ways that white Louisianans organized against Black suffrage were what were so-called race riots, interracial collisions orchestrated by white supremacist groups to intimidate or commit violence against Black voters, most notably the aforementioned New Orleans riot of 1866. It was only the Republican Party's overwhelming success in that election which gave new hope to the suffrage issue. The Reconstruction Acts placed Louisiana in the 5th Military District, and beginning in late spring of 1867, the 5th District Commander was tasked with supervising voter registration. This is the active involvement of the federal government in registering voters, a very controversial subject, even at the time. They are tasked with doing this so that Louisiana will write a new state constitution. Enthusiasm is absolutely infectious for these first elections. Black Union veterans in particular seized on Black suffrage as the validating and empowering measure of their service to the Union. Republicans were elected in nearly every district to draw a new constitution, and roughly half of the 98 seats went to candidates of some African ancestry. This image is quite famous. This is called the first colored senator and representatives, one of the most iconic images of Reconstruction anywhere in America. This image continues to appear in countless textbooks to this day, and it did not depict the reactionary violence that I've been telling you a little about. It did not depict the Klan. It did not depict voter intimidation. It merely reprinted the text of Louisiana's new constitution amongst the state's first ever group of Black political representatives. The achievement of this was considered so remarkable in Reconstruction that this image was lithographed and it was sold by the renowned printmakers Currier and Ives, which is where this comes from. This new state constitution gave Black Louisianans what one historian called the bold claim of civil and political rights, granting suffrage to all men who had been resident in the state for a year and in a parish for 10 days. Broad suffrage was the explicit goal of this constitution, and it spoke to the explicit needs of the post-war period. Freed slaves needed political voice to counteract the reassertion of mastery by their former owners. Black Louisianans for decades held this constitution, the 1868 Constitution, in almost holy regard, what they called a shining beacon of what was and could be again, which is a great way to understand this moment of really inspirational history in the state of Louisiana. For the first time in this state, the massive Black population had expressed their democratic voice. They had voted for universal suffrage, interracial marriage, civil and political rights of citizens without regard to color or previous condition. In other words, they enlarged the scope of civic privileges of all races instead of restricting it. To step outside the period of Reconstruction, as I told you I wouldn't do. Oh, it's just rolling forward again. I don't know why it keeps doing this. I'm so sorry. Hopefully that we can get that slide back up. My research into this topic has been going on for the last few years and has broadly shown that more than any other through line in the history of the state, the restriction of Black voting has been the most consistent goal of white Louisianans from 1862 to the present day. I testified in federal court here in Baton Rouge, and this is just a segment of my report. The story of Black suffrage in Louisiana is the story of freedom-seeking former slaves and status-preserving masters. Disenfranchising efforts were fueled by a special desire to exclude a burgeoning electorate likely hostile to white supremacist policies that had so long dominated the state. Hand in hand with foundational societal beliefs and customs built to reinforce white supremacy, Louisiana's laws and lifeways were explicitly designed to exclude non-white people from the political, social, educational, and economic rights enjoyed by white citizens. These discriminatory practices have been extensively documented by historians, plainly admitted to by many Louisiana lawmakers across its 210-year statehood. Even with this much evidence and open hostility to Black political participation, contesting the tools of white supremacy has taken many forms across the past 150 plus years. Throughout, Louisiana has overwhelmingly and consistently designed policies that could protect white voters while disenfranchising Black voters. Now, as I've mentioned, disenfranchising Black voters was a violent process in the 1870s and 80s and genuinely a plague on Reconstruction Louisiana. At no other time or place in American history has there been more sustained and varied acts of political terrorism designed to disenfranchise any population, much less Black voters. White Louisianans continued to respond with belligerence, violence, and a relentless determination to roll back the civil rights advances of the 1860s. We proclaim that we are opposed to Negro suffrage under any circumstances. We stand ready to use all legitimate means to prevent its present and future exercise. This is one Louisiana newspaper writing in the 1870s. Indeed, that period is most defined by the proliferation of these organizations I mentioned a moment ago: white supremacist leagues, clubs, what are called rifle companies, violently and virulently anti-Black groups like the Knights of the White Camellia were obsessed with Black displays of independence, in particular, forbidding Blacks to beat drums, even cutting drums up at political rallies or election times. This is a white man's country, and we don't allow that. Black Republicans were informed before being beaten with sticks and pistols. On election day in one parish, white liners dragged a 24-pound cannon to the polling place and then began beating potential Black voters. And the votes themselves told the story of the effectiveness of racial terrorism in Louisiana. Republican votes plummeted in one parish from 1,400 in 1873 to 90 in 1875. And these plummeting numbers are the exact purpose, the very design of white terrorism in Louisiana and elsewhere. That terrorism, which was intended to disenfranchise Black voters and their Republican allies, peaked around 1873 and 1874, striking the tone for a century of white supremacist domination of the politics in the state of Louisiana. and the relentless attacks on Black political rights. On April 13th of 1873, that's Easter Sunday, white terrorists perpetrated what became best known as the Colfax Massacre, an event that would influence Louisiana far beyond the 1870s. This is an outgrowth of the disputed electoral results of 1872, where tension between Democrats and Republicans had simmered and boiled over into violence several times before hundreds of local Blacks, including women, children, and armed men, gathered at the Colfax courthouse to show their support for the Republican candidates they had voted for. At least 150 local whites armed with a cannon, as a trend, and mounted riders forced the Black attendees into the courthouse at Colfax and then set fire to it. Shooting erupted. One leader of the Knights of the White Camellia was killed along with another white man, and the white mob began firing into the crowd. Over the course of the day, somewhere between 60 and 250 Black Louisianans defending election results were murdered. Colfax was followed a year later by similar violence of the Coushatta Massacre, where the local White League assassinated 6 white Republicans and as many as 20 Blacks who had witnessed those killings. The local White League had embarked upon this project of what they called extermination, sending political vigilantes to murder a Black Republican in the Brownsville community on August 25th of 1874. The next day, several prominent white Republicans were arrested on the pretext of the most profound antebellum fear that they were plotting a murderous Negro rebellion. The invocation, which recalled the 1811 German Coast slave uprising, so well known to white Louisianans, drew heavily armed whites out from neighboring parishes who thronged the streets of Coushatta, swearing, drinking, and demanding blood. Sham trials were conducted. All the accused white Republicans were murdered before White Leaguers seized a Black leader named Levin Allen, broke his arms and legs, and burned him alive. The White League continued this terrorist violence by hanging 2 more Black voters. And in reality, the so-called Coushatta Massacre was not a spontaneous mob action, but actually a coup d'etat. Indeed, the officialdom of an entire parish, white men, Republicans, had been virtually decapitated by this single murderous act. The massacre was another stunning revelation to Black and white Republicans about the future of politics in Louisiana. White terrorists in service of the Democratic Party had removed and executed the Republican leadership of the parish, murdering them with impunity. Indeed, none of the lynch mob would ever be brought to justice. In Louisiana in the 1870s, it was not safe to hold elected office as a Republican. Just 2 weeks later in New Orleans, any remaining illusion of Republican political control or even basic public safety was shattered. Another concerted effort to intimidate Blacks and Republicans and regain control of New Orleans and the state culminated in a pitched military operation between Republican-led police forces and the White League of New Orleans. Although this was erroneously dubbed the Battle of Liberty Place, and lamented, much like Reconstruction itself, as a tragedy for white supremacist whites, the truth was quite the opposite. On September 14th, the White League routed Republican authorities and took control of the city within hours. The Black State Militia was forcibly disarmed and disbanded, and what distinguished Liberty Place from Coushatta, Colfax, and especially the New Orleans Massacre of 1866 was very deliberate planning by white supremacist leaders in Louisiana. These men took extreme care not to commit murderous outrages because of the national public relations fiasco of previous white supremacist violence. Through the terror caused by murders and threats, the colored people are thoroughly intimidated, one observer explained. Blacks are disenfranchised and are to be returned to a condition of serfdom, an era of second slavery. And yet, even these concerted efforts to intimidate and disenfranchise did not succeed in the face of the Black determination to vote. By 1888, the voter rolls in Louisiana registered a white nightmare. 128,150 Black voters and 125,407 white voters. The frightening prospect of Black voting majorities revealed that even the horrifying violence I've just described was not enough to dissuade Black Louisianans from the vote. Indeed, that realization among white elites inspired the voter disenfranchisement schemes that would dominate the next 150 years of Louisiana history. white electoral authorities, especially at the local level, responded immediately by outright voting fraud. This is the only substantial fraud, this in the 1890s, that was ever recorded in the state of Louisiana. Whites regularly changed or simply disposed of black votes stolen by Democratic election officials, as was the general practice in black majority districts. At the time, it was simply paramount to dispose of black as well as occasionally immigrant votes, regardless of legality. And this period, really the dawn of the 1890s, witnessed a shift from the white supremacist violence that I've described over the last few minutes to the legislative voter disenfranchisement that would define the rest of Louisiana's history. The introduction in the 1890s of poll taxes, grandfather clauses, literacy tests would combine with legal rulings to introduce nearly 7 decades of quite extreme and effective voter disenfranchisement. Despite these waves of white supremacist violence that specifically aimed at intimidating black voters, the period from 1868 to 1896 represents the high tide mark of black voting in the state of Louisiana to this day. In 1896, as I mentioned a little earlier, black citizens made up 45% of the state's registered voter, a number that has never been equaled since. In other words, despite the terrorist violence of white Louisianans, its success in driving out the federal government, who left essentially at the end of the 1870s, generally intimidating voters and altering the results of specific elections, black Louisianans remained intensely dedicated to practicing the freedoms they had fought so far long for and had so long been denied. Louisianans and visitors to the state marveled at how passionate freed people were for participatory democracy, to the point often of endangering their very lives. But disenfranchising plans and strategies were emerging across the former Confederacy at the dawn of the 1890s. And in May of 1894, a constitutional commission in Louisiana drafted a suffrage amendment, which established a series of qualifications designed to disenfranchise black voters, including residency requirements, poll taxes, literacy tests, or high bars of property ownership. The state legislature was simultaneously considering a secret ballot proposal, and indeed, white supremacist Democrats in the state had not yet figured out the delicate construction of literacy tests and other tools that would eventually allow them to retain immigrant voters they needed while getting rid of the black voters they feared. The 1896 election witnessed voter fraud that was unprecedented in Louisiana history, where the white supremacist gubernatorial candidate Murphy Foster obliterated his black opponents in the 25 black majority parishes. As the formal protest to the election explained, the results were so false and so infamous that it was going to require a complete audit of the ballot to get to the bottom of this election. As the ink on the forged ballots was still drying, the Picayune announced the lesson to be derived from the recent scurrilous election. The illiterate and shiftless population, chiefly but not wholly made up of the Negro element, should be expunged from politics. The democracy is pledged to a limitation upon suffrage, which will eliminate the Senegambian from politics as far as can be under the Constitution of the United States, Louisiana's Democratic Party leaders explained. Indeed, the legal changes that arrived in the 1890s were thoroughly unanticipated and punctuated the tragedy of Reconstruction. In particular, the infamous case of Homer Plessy helped transform this period of black triumph into nearly a century of black struggle, simply to regain civil rights that had already been won during Reconstruction. Plessy, a Louisianan chosen to test the legal changes taking place in the state, identified as a black man, but was classified as a Creole by Louisiana custom and could pass for white. Accordingly, he bought a first-class ticket on the East Louisiana Railway line on June 7th of 1892, taking his seat in a railway car designated for whites. Under the terms of the recent 1890 law, conductors on the trains, who were all white, were required to remove violators or risk jail and a fine themselves. Plessy was asked to move to the Negro-only car. Upon refusing, Plessy was removed by police, arrested, and locked up in the Orleans Parish Jail. The hope of the defendant and his allies was that the Supreme Court would affirm the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment and invalidate Louisiana law. Instead, Supreme Court Justice Henry Brown ruled against Plessy, finding that segregated public facilities did not mark the colored race with a badge of inferiority. After the Plessy-Ferguson decision in 1896, segregation took hold of American culture, then spread blood deep into every crevice, writes one historian about the case. It heralded a disastrous period for all of those who believed in American democracy. Every aspect of American life changed with the Plessy ruling. States were given the power to legislate social interaction between the races. The opinion instituted the separate but equal doctrine, which imposed on the country an Americanized version of apartheid. And indeed, Plessy marked a turning point for the worse for Black suffrage. Although the 30 years following Black enfranchisement in Louisiana were replete with violence and struggle, Black voter registration reached its highest point the year that Plessy was decided. States like Louisiana launched into action following the Supreme Court decision, using Plessy as a broad mandate to develop sophisticated and persistent methods to disenfranchise Black voters. And the next few decades showed Louisiana's unremitting and ingenious methods of ensuring that its Black citizens would no longer have an effect on the political process. Giving voice to this determination was a man named Ernest Crutchnit, the president of Louisiana's 1898 Constitutional Convention, who explained that the disenfranchisement of Black voters was the exact design of the Grandfather Clause. We know that this convention has been called together, Crutchnit explained, to eliminate from the electorate the mass of corrupt and illiterate voters who have, during the last quarter of a century, degraded our politics. Doesn't it let the white man vote, he continued, and doesn't it stop the Negro from voting? And isn't that what we came here for? Black voters would not begin to regain ground lost during this period until the civil rights movement began in earnest in the 1950s, and not achieve meaningful change until after the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. The fight for political rights and the power of the vote continues in Louisiana until this day. And it is because of this ongoing story that I believe it's so important for Louisianans of any color to know the history of Black suffrage during Reconstruction. It is a story, as I've mentioned, of tremendous obstacles, but also truly inspiring achievements. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Gilpin. And at this point, we'd like to open to any questions from the audience.
So one of the things I'm assuming is that women hadn't gotten the right to vote yet. So what was going on with the women during those period of time? And also any Native Americans and other people, what was happening for them?
I mean, the question of women's suffrage is a really complicated one and hugely controversial in terms of the nation during Reconstruction. Because basically, the women's suffrage movement, which began in earnest in the late 1840s, there's a sense among the people fighting for that Black men were basically going to steal their opportunity. And in a lot of ways, they were correct. I mean, the debates that are going on among radical Republicans in Washington around the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, when the topic of women is raised, there are quite revealing conversations where they say, we can't do both of these things. The choice is essentially, I mean, the choice that they are really rendering is saying, we can either choose to enfranchise Black men or enfranchise no one. And so women were going to have to wait to 1920 in order for this to happen for them. And this is obviously, I think, a hugely embittering process for many supporters of women's suffrage during the 1860s and 70s, basically essentially seeing this thing that they've been fighting for 2 decades slip out of their fingers. And also many of their allies in that fight, including many prominent abolitionists, who were saying this is a much greater priority. There's some very famous interactions between actually 2 friends, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Frederick Douglass, where they're arguing about who needs the vote more. And it's really a fascinating process that's really, I mean, is sad at the end of the day.